那我是台大土木系康世仲康老师。那今天很高兴大家这么多人哦，我知道很多不是台大的师生，但是今天都晚上可以拨空来到这边，然后一起来听我们这个跟学习非常有关的一个演讲哦。我相信大家今天把时间拨空出来坐在这边绝对是物超所值。我在开始之前呢，是特别跟我讲说，要请大家手机关机啊，然后不要突然就是这个待会响啊，就是关成静音啊，或者是直接把它关机。那我这边非常感谢大家的莅临我想我在接下来可能就用英文来介绍我们的今天的讲者今天整个场次都是用英文来说明对，就是英文来讲述，还有待会的这个座谈时间都是英文讲述。今天是第1个小时，是这个 Professor Barbara Oakley 会来介绍他的这个题目叫 Learning How to Learn。那在第2小时，我们就有不一样的有教授有我们的博士班学生然后这个我们的校友还有硕士班学生来跟他对谈。在这个对谈之间希望可以帮大家问到你想要听的问题。好，那我现在就来用英文来介绍我们的讲者。It's my great honor to introduce Professor Barbara Oakley from Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan. This is her first time to visit Taiwan. She is leaving early tomorrow morning. I really appreciate she can give the talk this evening. Now I would like to briefly introduce her background. First, I want to emphasize Professor Oakley is the most well-known Coursera instructor. Of course, you already know this. Her course, Learning How to Learn, is extremely popular, taken by more than a million students, million learners from 200 countries. Because of the popularity, she was invited to give the keynote talks in Coursera Partners Meeting, teaching hundreds of Coursera instructors, including me, to how to teach. And second, Professor Oakley wrote a book, A Mind for Numbers. It was New York Times best-selling science book. This book has been translated into many languages, luckily include traditional Chinese. So I encourage you to buy one after this talk. From my close observation these days, Professor Oakley arrived 4 days ago. Yeah, so I have a very close observation. I feel Professor Oakley has true MOOC spirits. He is eager to share the knowledge. She has a schedule, the full schedule from this morning to now. She eager to share the knowledge to those who need. She is always a good storyteller and also a visualizer, knowing how to explain a complex concept to general audience. And of course, he is always keen to take advantage of modern technology to link the world of academia to the real life. So we are so lucky to have her here. So I hope you can join me to welcome Professor Oakley.
Hello, hello. I'm so happy to be here. I love Taiwan. You are so lucky to live here, I have to say. So, but I have to begin by thanking Professor Kang for inviting me here. This is really quite an honor. And I have to start by telling you a little secret about me. I love to watch people. I just love it. So I have to tell you about one of the most interesting people I've ever watched. This guy could mimic almost anybody. he was like the world's greatest mimic. And it was when I was working down in Antarctica, so I worked down at the South Pole Station, but this was at McMurdo Station. And this guy, he was just this thin, wispy little guy. He had a big head, so he looked like this sort of upside down exclamation point. And he had kind of a wispy little voice. But the station manager, on the other hand, the little guy was named Neil. The station manager was this big guy, like 6'8". I don't know, what would that be? Almost like 3 meters or something. I mean, and he had this deep baritone voice. And his name was Art Brown. Well, what Neil used to like to do is he'd pick up the phone when it rang, and he'd say, "Hello, this is Art Brown speaking." So one day the phone rings and Neil picks it up and he says, "Hello, this is Art Brown speaking." And it was Art Brown on the other end of the line. So Art goes, "Who the hell is this?" And Neil says, "Why, Art, this is you. I'm so glad you've finally gotten in touch with yourself." And so that's actually what we're going to be doing here this evening. We're going to be helping you to get in touch with one of the deepest attributes that you have as a human being, and that is your ability to learn. So I should probably begin by giving you just a little bit of background about myself. I grew up moving all over the US. So by the time I hit 10th grade, I was about 14, I lived in 10 different places. Now, as you know, math and science is really sequential. So if you fall off anywhere along the line, it's hard to get back on. Well, when I was moving from Lubbock, Texas to Chelmsford, Massachusetts, I was about 7 years old, they were suddenly way ahead of me in multiplication. And I was like, oh, I can't do this. I can't do math. And in fact, I can't do science. And so I ended up flunking my way through elementary, middle, and high school math and science, which is kind of funny because I'm really standing here in front of you as a professor of engineering. And I'm the real deal. I publish in good journals. I mean, I do pretty well. But one day, one of my students asked me, he said, he found out about my terrible past as a math flunky. And he said, "How'd you do it? How'd you change your brain?" And I thought, how did I do that? Because I grew up, I was this little kid. This is, I'm telling you, this is the last cute picture of me. I loved animals, and I liked knitting, and I loved language, but I grew up in a household where we spoke only one language, and you can guess what language that was. And I thought, wouldn't it be so cool to be able to understand and speak in another language? So my main goal growing up was I wanted to learn another language. Now, at that time, there were not student loans available, and I could not afford to go to college. But there was one way I could learn another language and get paid for it, and that was to join the Army. So I did. I still remember my dad going, "Boy, you're gonna learn a lot." And so that's me looking really nervous about to throw a hand grenade. And if you knew how clumsy I am, you would know why I look so nervous. But I did learn another language. I learned Russian, and so I ended up working down or up on the Bering Sea as a Russian translator on Soviet trawlers. And I loved learning new perspectives and seeing the world through adventures. And so I also ended up at the South Pole Station in Antarctica. That's me standing there. It's funny, you look at most people and they look like heroes. I just always look kind of cold. So anyway, I did. I had a great adventure down there. I met my husband. And so I always have to say, I had to go to the end of the earth to meet that man. But I began to realize something, though, after a while, that I was having these new perspectives, new adventures, kind of seeing new things, kind of learning new things, except for one thing. I never would touch math and science. And I reflected back when I worked with all these West Point engineers in the Army. They'd have these books that just were like, they'd have these equations in them, and I'd look at them and I'd be like, oh my word, how could you understand that? That's just like a foreign language. And then I began to realize something else. I was coming up towards the end of my service commitment, and I had one single professional expertise, and that was the ability to speak Russian. And you know what? No, the world is not banging down doors to hire people whose only ability is to speak Russian. So I thought, if I am really truly open to new perspectives and new learning, I should be open enough to want to try and change my brain. Why don't I get out of the military and see if I can learn math and science? So at age 26, I got out and I started with remedial high school math. It was like bottom level stuff. And I began to gradually sort of work my way upwards. Now, as I began to try to answer that student's question, years later, how did you change your brain? I thought, you know what I should do? I should write a book about this, because I like to write books, and it'll be very straightforward. It wasn't, but I started to put together a manuscript, and what I did was, there's an evaluation system in English-speaking countries called RateMyProfessors.com. And so I went and I found like the top 2,000 or 3,000 professors in math, science, economics, engineering, all these, and I emailed them and I said, hey, guess what? I wrote this manuscript for this book on how you learn effectively in math and science. Would you be willing to take a look at this book? And shocking numbers of people said yes, which meant that I had to go through all this, all their answers, which was like a lot of answers. But one thing I found that was in common, that was it really surprised me, was that a lot of the top professors in math and science and engineering and STEM disciplines, they used metaphor and analogy to convey their key ideas. So they were actually using ideas from literature, from the humanities, from the social sciences, and using them in great teaching. But you know what? They didn't want me to tell anybody that it was them doing that, because a lot of times other professors would give them a bad time. They'd say, hey, you're dumbing down the material. But what we know now from neuroscience is they were actually, you use the same neural circuits to understand the metaphor as you do to understand the very difficult concept itself. So that was a key thing that I learned from other professors about how do you teach effectively in really tough subjects. But I also reached out to top neuroscientists and top cognitive psychologists, and I myself have studied and done research not only in engineering but also in learning through the decades. And so what I want to share with you this evening is the best of what we found about how you learn effectively. Now the thing is, the brain is like super complicated. But fortunately, because we're humans, we can simplify its operation into two fundamentally different modes. The first one I'll call focused mode. And everybody knows focus mode. You focus on me, you're focusing. Diffuse mode is the second. Diffuse mode is when you kind of get tired of listening to me and you're looking out towards the window a little bit. Or you're going to take take a shower and you're not thinking about anything in particular. You're going for a walk, sitting on a bus, falling asleep. That's diffuse mode. Focus mode you can turn on instantly, right? Like a flashlight. Diffuse mode you have to relax into, and you can't necessarily tell yourself to turn it on at that time, right? It's like saying, go to sleep. No, it doesn't work that way. So to better understand these two different modes, we're going to use, wait for it, a metaphor. And the metaphor or the analogy that we're going to use is that of a pinball machine. Now, if you're of a certain age, you probably remember pinball machines, and if you don't, their operation's pretty easy. You just pull back on the plunger, and a ball goes boinking around on the rubber bumpers, and that's how you get points. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this pinball machine, and we're going to insert it right onto the human brain. So this is the human brain. We've got our little nose up there, and we've got the ears right there. And okay, you ready for it? You guys, there's the pinball machine on the human brain. So this is the analogy for the focused mode of thinking. And the key thing to see here is that, see these rubber bumpers? They're really close together. So when you think a thought, well, first off, you have a pattern that's already there. In focus mode, usually you're kind of familiar with like multiplication. If you think a thought about like, what's 45 times 22, something like that. You think that thought and it moves along smoothly in the patterns you've already laid. But what if you're trying to learn about something that you've never experienced before? So let's say you know division, or know multiplication, but you don't know division. So division would be kind of like this pattern over here, at least metaphorically speaking. You think about it. I mean, you've got a neural pattern related to division that you're trying to acquire, and you've never thought it before. How do you even get that pattern into your brain? I mean, you don't know where it is in your brain, you don't know what it feels like, you don't know how to get to it. So how do you even get there to realize what division is? Well, as it turns out, you first focus, and then you reach a point where you can't make any progress. You're kind of stuck. What you're doing, you're trying to learn division. You're often using patterns that are related to something else that you're more familiar with. But they can be misleading. They can actually kind of trap you in those patterns, and you need new patterns. So the best way to tackle it when you start feeling frustrated is you go to the diffuse mode. Now the diffuse mode, if you look here, you can see those little rubber bumpers. See how far apart they are from one another? When you think a thought, here's what happens. It ranges along far more broadly. So what that means is you get stuck, you go to diffuse mode, and you can at least get to a new place in your brain, or once you go back into focus mode, you can start refining and analyzing whatever you're learning. The trick is, as long as you're focusing, really focusing on what's going on, you are blocking your ability to go into the diffuse mode. And so you often can't solve the problem that you want to solve. Now, an important issue here is you're either in focus mode or you're in diffuse mode, but you can't be in both modes at the same time. So when you get stuck, you've got to let go and let your brain sort of relax a little bit in order to tackle the problem in a new way. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, boy, this is really great. This professor's here with this, great solution to how I can solve these problems. How do people actually use it in real life? Well, I have to say tell you about some of my favorite people and how they use this in real life. So, anybody know who this guy is? So, I see some nods. Salvador Dali, that's right. And he was one of the great surrealist painters of the early 20th century. So Dali was the original wild and crazy guy. You can see him, he's got his pet ocelot, Babu. And what Dali used to do, he would sit in a chair when he had kind of a difficult problem with his painting, sit in a chair with a key in his hand, and he'd relax away, just as he'd relax so much that he'd fall asleep. The key would fall from his hands, the clatter would wake him up, and off he'd go. He'd take those ideas from the diffuse mode back into the focus mode, where he could refine and analyze them. So that's what Dali used to do. So I know what you're thinking now. You're thinking, well, yeah, but I'm an engineering student, so what's in it for me? Okay, so let's talk about that. This guy was Thomas Edison, one of the most prolific inventors in history. And what Edison used to do, at least according to legend, when he had a difficult technological problem he wanted to solve, he'd sit in a chair, relax away with ball bearings in his hands, and he'd relax, kind of loosely thinking about some problem he was trying to solve. And just as he'd relax so much that the ball bearings would fall from his hand, the clatter would wake him up, and off he'd go. He'd take those ideas from the diffuse mode back into the focus mode, where he could refine and analyze them. So the lesson for us is this. These creative geniuses used both modes to help them solve their problems. But we can do the same, solving the problems that we face when we're learning. In fact, when you look at a problem, I don't care if 2 million other students around the world have solved that problem before. For you, it is just as creative as for the first person who ever solved that problem. So you too can use some of these creative approaches to problem solving that can be very helpful. So one piece of advice I give to students out of this is something I call hard start, jump to easy, which is it's a valuable technique when you're solving tests. When you get a test, you want to take it, you want to read it through, you want to pick out the hardest problem, and that's what you want to start with. Now, I know you're thinking, wait a minute, but I've always been told start with the easiest problem, right? But here's what happens. If you look through it quickly, pick the toughest looking one and start with that, but control yourself. So you pull yourself off it as soon as you hit a stumbling block. As soon as you start to feel like, I'm not sure where I'm going, stop. And usually that's around maybe 2 minutes after you get started on it, right? Not very long. And then you go off, you work on other problems, but guess what you've just done? You've focused. Now you're changing your focus, and in the background of your mind, you are continuing to subconsciously process. So you work away on the other problem, or maybe another couple problems, then you go back to that first problem. You can make progress that you couldn't make before because you've had some time to sort of, in some sense, your mind is parallel processing. You're working consciously on something, but subconsciously you're working in the background on this other problem. So you, instead of getting up to the very end, you're all panicked and you look at the toughest problem. That's the last time you want to start working on the toughest problem in the test. Start a little bit at the beginning. You can make great progress by using this hard start, jump to easy technique. So the thing is, it takes time. Learning takes time. Often focusing intently in one session to figure something out, that means cramming the night before a big test is probably not a good idea. But what I'd like you to do now is I would like you to team up, and what I want you to do is hopefully you can turn to someone who you don't know previously, introduce yourself to one another, and then what I'd like you to do is take 2 minutes and explain what is the difference between focused and diffuse mode. Try and get a better handle on it. So on your mark, get set, 2 minutes, go. For pedagogical, do I take questions? Let's see. I'll take one question from you. And then we'll save the others because I think we have a pretty limited time frame. So we'll let you ask your question.
Thank you. So my question is, are the two modes physically detectable, or are they just an abstract concept?
I don't even need to repeat that question because it was so beautifully phrased and a great question. They're absolutely detectable. In fact, the differences between these two modes was discovered initially by a fellow named Marcus Rakel in 2001 at Washington University. He published the first paper on what he called the default mode network, which is one of the many resting state networks. But what happens is, here's how they found it. They were always saying, now what happens when you concentrate on musical tone, for example, or what happens when you concentrate on this mathematical problem, or this poem, or what happens when you concentrate on anything. And then accidentally one day, there was this time he said, just don't think about anything in particular. And then he goes back and looks, and the neural signature that was seen under magnetic resonance imaging was really different. And so now you can actually, using diffusion tensor technology, you can see like a different web becoming active when you're in one of these resting states, as opposed to when you're focusing on things. And there is some evidence that like diffuse mode, or that the network that's involved in that it seems to have some longer connections, the neurons do. And that goes in line with what we've just kind of described, that there's a further distance between those rubber bumpers. So that's the first time I've ever been asked that question. It's a really good one. So, okay, so here's the thing. We procrastinate. So what's the big deal? I'm saying, hey, we need to focus and then relax and all this kind of stuff, but we tend to procrastinate. We put it off until the very last second. So how do we have time to go between those two modes? Well, procrastination is so important that I'm going to spend just a minute or two talking about it. So it turns out that when we procrastinate, when we think about something we would really rather not do, like let's say, your math homework or English or something like that. You don't want to do it. It activates the pain centers of your brain. So your brain, naturally enough, looks for ways to kind of avoid that, and that causes problems for you. In fact, let's kind of walk through what happens when you procrastinate. Procrastination is just a habit. And this habit arises because, first off, you kind of think about something you'd rather not do, you feel a little uncomfortable, so you funnel your attention to something that's more pleasant, and the result is that you feel better almost instantly. Now, you do this once, you do it twice, no big deal. You do it very often, and it actually is, it's like an addiction that leads to really bad long-term effects on your life. You can even think that you can't do math, for example, or you can't do Chinese, you can't do, just because you procrastinated, not because you really can't do it. So, since I'm an engineer now, I'll just cut right to the chase. How can you tackle procrastination? There's a very simple tool, and it's called the Pomodoro technique. This was invented by an Italian, Francesco Cediolo, in the early 1980s, and it's a super easy technique. Now, the thing is, so I teach this course. For whatever reason, it has become the world's most popular course. People really find a lot of value in it. This is one of the things they find most valuable. So that tells you that this is probably something you really want to focus on right here, because others have found it so valuable, you probably will too. So what is the Pomodoro technique? If you, to do it, all you need to do is turn off all your distractions. What that means is, that cell phone? Turn it off, so there's no little buzzers, no ringing, nothing like that. Turn it off. Have you ever done this thing where, I'll put my cell phone over on a cabinet so I can work over here, and then I look at my hand and the cell phone's back in my hand. So the thing is, but you want to turn off, and so nothing from your computer, no little buzzers or anything when the emails might come in or anything like that. Then you just set a timer. Any timer will do. You can see that Francesco Cediolo had a tomato-shaped timer. Pomodoro is Italian for tomato, but any timer will do. You can download Pomodoro apps, and they're really valuable. A lot of people really like using Pomodoro apps. I just have a little timer on my computer that I use. And then what you do is you set your timer for 25 minutes, and then you focus for 25 minutes. That's all you have to do, is focus as intently as you can for 25 minutes. If you're taking photographs of this, wait for one more thing before you take the photograph, because the one last thing is super important, right? So you want to, now sometimes when I'm focusing, I'll do something like this. I'll be like, okay, working away. I don't want to be working on this, but I'm working away. And I check the timer, and I'm 5 minutes into a 25-minute Pomodoro, and I'm like, oh my, I can't do 20 more minutes. Right? I'm the expert, and I feel this way. Well, here's what I do. I just let that thought just go right on by, and then I return my focus to whatever I'm working on. And everybody has these kinds of mental distractions arise. You're perfectly normal if they arise. And all you want to do is just kind of let them go by and just focus. The whole idea is to focus as intently as you can, not perfectly. Nobody can be perfect. And here's the final part of the slide, and then you can take the picture. Okay. The reward. So what you want to do is you want to reward yourself after you've done a Pomodoro. So what that means is you do your 25 minutes. Is there a song you really like to listen to? Go listen to that song. Or go on Facebook, or go get a cup of coffee, or take a little ramble around, anything to comfortably distract yourself and switch your attention for a little while. Now, some people like to collect Pomodoros, so they might do like 5 or 8 Pomodoros in a day, and they find that it's kind of like gamification. You're trying to, collect these things, and it works really well for them, so that's something to consider for you. But like for me, I find that if I do 1 Pomodoro, it gets me kind of in the mode, and then I'm working away. Interestingly, remember how I said that pain in the brain arises when you think about something you don't want to do? That pain, it dies away after 20 minutes, right? They've watched it neuroscientifically, it dies away. Well, the Pomodoro is 25 minutes. So it gets you over the hump and into a state where you're more into the flow. Now, the thing is, I guess one more little thing, don't focus on finishing a task. So don't sit there and go, I'm going to take this Pomodoro in the next 25 minutes, I'm going to finish, a dozen homework problems. No, as soon as you think of what you want to finish, you're activating the pain centers. Just think, I don't care what I have to do, but I've got to do it for 25 minutes and just, kind of get yourself to do that. What you're doing is tricking your brain into working on whatever needs to be done. And oftentimes you'll just be surprised at how effective this can be. Now, good learning, here's the thing about good learning. It's a lot like baking a great cake. Sometimes people will come to me and say, what's the most important thing about good learning? And I'm like, well, what's the most important thing about a great cake? I mean, you've got eggs in it, you've got flour, you've got the frosting, which I don't like. You've got the, what temperature do you cook it at? What pressure is it at? If you're in the high mountains, that can affect it. So in a similar fashion to baking a great cake is making great learning. There's lots of different aspects to it. So I'm going to jump now to a different aspect of learning, and this aspect involves sleep. Now, we've all known, everybody always says, get some good sleep, and you kind of ignore it, right? But I'm going to give you a little insight into why you do want to consider getting good sleep. If you look, these little round circles represent neurons. Now what happens is, as the day goes by, your neurons kind of give out these little metabolic toxins, right? And these metabolites go out and they're sitting there kind of drifting around in between the neurons there, and they can't be washed away because those neurons are big. They're like big boulders blocking a stream. But here's what they just found a couple years ago, was that when you go to sleep, your brain cells, watch this is so good, your brain cells shrink. I love this, so I gotta do it again. So when you go to sleep, your brain cells shrink. And so what that means is that, we're gonna go to sleep? So what happens is, once these have shrunk, the fluids can wash by much more easily, and that washes the toxins away. So this is part of why sleeping is so important, is because it allows those toxins to be washed away. Now, I've known even doctoral students who come in and have had no sleep before their biggest examination of their life. I mean, it's crazy. These are smart people, but because they don't know why you need to have good sleep, they just don't do it. So now you know why. And in fact, I'll tell you a little bit more about why sleep is really important. If you look at this image, it's a light microscopy. Light microscopy is this incredible new technique. And what happens is, see, this technique allows us to image living neurons over time. So this is a living neuron, and this is imaged before learning and before sleep. And this image is the same neuron, that same exact neuron after learning and after sleep. And if you look, wherever I've got these little yellow triangles, those are where new synaptic connections are forming. So when you go to sleep at night, it's not like, oh, you know, it's all mush and I wake up with the same brain. No, you wake up in the morning with an upgrade, right? It's a better deal than you get from Microsoft. But this is a big reason why. Sleep is when you are growing that neural architecture. And so this is why it's very important to space out your learning. And so we've got a little bit of mistranslation, I guess, on those slides here. But this is why you want to not cram. You want to space your learning out day by day, because if you cram, your little metabolic vampires can more easily suck those patterns away. They're not going to be as solid. Metaphorically speaking, it's like this. You lay these bricks, and you need a little time in between the laying of the bricks for the mortar to dry, and then you've got a really good brick wall. If you don't do that, it looks like this sort of jumbled mess, and it's not, you don't have a structure to build a solid wall of learning. Now, there's another aspect of learning that I'd also like to discuss, and that relates to exercise. If we could put if mental effects of exercise into a bottle, we would all be multi-billionaires. I mean, it has such an incredibly powerful effect. Within a few days of starting an exercise program, you can see profound effects in people's ability to learn and remember. Now, this little mouse here is being taught to differentiate between these two patterns. And what we used to think was you're born with all the neurons that you'll ever have in your life, and they gradually die off, and you get dumber, and then you die. And it was totally depressing. So, thank goodness, it's wrong. Here's what really happens. Every day, new neurons are born in your hippocampus, which is an important part for learning and memory, important part of the brain. But if you exercise, more neurons are born. And not only that, they survive better when you're exercising. So you're growing new neural structures that you can use for learning more easily if you exercise. So this mouse in particular, if you take a look, see those blue blobs there? Those are old neurons. And the red ones are new neurons. They could detect that. And they found there were way more new neurons in the mice that were allowed to exercise. So it is very similar for us, and now there's lots and lots. This paper was done, about 15 years ago, and it kind of launched our understanding of the importance of exercise. Now, if you look, this paper was done in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and this guy right here, Terrence Sejnowski, is one of the co-authors. And it turns out that he is my co-instructor in the massive open online course. So what happened was I was filming the MOOC. The MOOC is the massive open online course. I was filming it, and we went to La Jolla, which is in California. And I asked Terry, met with Terry, and we're like getting all the stuff ready for the MOOC. And I happened to mention, Terry's going, exercise is really important, and I worked on this paper, and there's all these other papers, and it's really super important. So I go, okay, well, Terry, what about you? Do you exercise? So Terry's like, exercise? Do I exercise? So let's see, where's my mouse here? Okay, there we go. Okay. So, there he is. Okay. So, see these cliffs over on the right-hand side? They're like over 100 meters tall. He goes bounding down those cliffs, every other day or so and goes running on the beach just like that. I love how this ends up. Look at that. So he doesn't just read this information. I'm convinced Terry is one of only 10 living human beings who's simultaneously a member of the National Academy of Sciences of the USA, National Academy of Engineering, and National Institutes of Medicine. He has nearly 100,000 research citations. I mean, the guy's freaking brilliant. But I'm convinced that part of the reason for this is he incorporates these ideas from research that are really valuable in our everyday lives. And we can do that too. So let's move on. What I'd like to talk about now is sort of a different aspect of learning, and that relates to our working memory. Now, we used to think there were like 7 slots in working memory. So that meant you could remember maybe 7 numbers, like 453, 2439, right? You could remember those numbers kind of in some sense holding them in slots, right, mentally. Well, now we're beginning to understand it's probably more like 4 slots in working memory. You can hold 4 items. I don't know, I'm kind of convinced that in Taiwan it's more like 6 items. For me, before my coffee, I'm lucky to have 2 items, right? But anyway, so you can think metaphorically, it's kind of like this. When you are focusing on something, it's kind of like you have this octopus of attention that reaches through those slots of working memory and makes connections into your long-term memory. So that's what this octopus is doing. But let's say that you're sitting there and you're listening to me, and you've got your cell phone over there, and you've got this really interesting video that you're also watching. So it's a little bit like this is what you're doing. You're taking off one part of your working memory, which is part of your intelligence, and you're blocking it off. So that those 3 remaining sort of tendrils, in some sense, you're less intelligent about what you actually are still trying to focus on. So if you're doing your homework and you're kind of like partly watching television or partly listening to some other conversations and working, you're less efficient at what you're working on. So that's why it's a very good idea to try to focus efficiently when you are working, to leave yourself more time for play afterwards, right? Because you're being more efficient about your focused energy. This is just a little bit of a contrast here. This is the diffuse mode. There's no controlling octopus of attention. It's just sort of random tendrils going wherever you want them to go. Or not wanting, they just randomly make those connections. So sometimes people will ask me, is background music okay? That's probably a question a lot of you. Well, here's the thing. Whatever you want that answer to be, you can find research that will give you that answer. So the real answer is the verdict is kind of out. There's some very interesting research from video games that a little bit of music sometimes is helpful for some problem solving. But on the other hand, memory experts who are really trying to focus and concentrate, they block out all sounds altogether. So just kind of look and see what works for you, but be aware that it may or may not affect you. So if you're just looking, you can kind of learn a little bit. Another thing is it's good to change your location when you're studying. For example, don't always study in the same place in the library or in your room or wherever. You want to mix it up because when you're learning something, you are learning it in the context that's surrounding you. And that makes it easier for you to remember if you're in that context. So let's say you always study in the library and then you have to go take a big test in the classroom. You're not going to do as well, right? Because you're not in that same environment. So if you mix up, like you study in a coffee shop and another coffee shop and then in a library and different places, you become independent of where you're learning. And so it's a good idea to do that kind of thing. Now, how do you get something from working memory into long-term memory? Practice makes permanent. You broaden your sort of neural pathways when you practice more. So it's sort of like this. You practice, you deepen and richen those neural pathways, and that's very, very helpful in developing what neural chunks that we're going to talk about in just a moment. So if you don't do that, again, those little neural vampires, metabolic vampires, can suck those patterns away. So there's a critical thing that I want to touch on in this talk, and that is the idea of chunking. So chunking is, if you look at something and it's raw information, you're trying to figure the pattern out, then what's happening is your prefrontal cortex, your working memory there, is going nuts. And we can see it going nuts in neural imaging. But once you figure that pattern out, you recognize that guy? That's my hubby. I don't know if I'll ever figure him out, though. He's quite that. So once you understand what that information is, then you in some sense have it chunked into one solid ribbon, right? One connected pattern. Instead of this jumble where your brain is trying to put things together, you have this pattern or this ribbon of a pattern, and you can pull it up in working memory whenever you want to. And here's the key part. You pull it up, but you still have parts of your working memory free and open. So you can think about some concept and make connections to other concepts. If you don't have that basic pattern chunked, then what happens is you're in this stage. And so you're on a test, you look at it, and it all seems like, it's very confusing. And then you go to your professor and say, I suffer from test anxiety. And it actually isn't true. It's just that you haven't really processed and chunked the material, got it in one solid neural pattern. So this is our younger daughter. So she's, chunking is something, it's not just learning how to use an equation in math and science, or how to decline a verb in Latin or in German, or how to do a pattern in sports or in dance, or how to do a song, right? How to play the piano. It's in all areas where you develop expertise in life. So, for example, so here's our younger daughter, and she's demonstrating chunking in backing up a car. So I did, this massive open online course. And so while I was working on it, well, here's the funny thing. So I go into Harvard, they invite me to speak about the MOOC. And the room was packed. There's like all these Harvard and MIT people, Kennedy School, and I'm like, well, how could there be all these people, bigwigs, just watching little me? I'm just an engineering professor. I'm no biggie, like they are. But it turns out our one little MOOC made for less than $5,000. So what would that translate into in Taiwan? Okay, so let's see. 150,000 NT dollars. Okay, so our one MOOC has on the order of the same number of students as all 60 of Harvard's MOOCs put together, made for millions of US dollars with hundreds of people, right? So it's very possible for ordinary people like us to do things that people really find valuable, and you don't need to be a big university professor to do it. But part of the way, so how do we do it so cheaply? It's because I use my family members. So anyway, so I asked the kids, I'm like, okay, I need to know, can somebody model backing up a car badly? And my younger daughter's like, I can do that. Yes. So here she is. Now, the thing to recognize is when you first learn to back up a car, it's really difficult. You look around, your little working memory's going crazy, you're trying to figure things out, and then when you learn to back it up, you can even be talking to friends, and you're kind of just backing up, and it's no big deal at all. So she's modeling right here. Look at her little face. She's like going a little crazy as she's trying. Wait, no. What do I do? Let's see. And she backs the wrong way, and then she backs the other way. But this just demonstrates the idea that chunking is really important, and we neglect it because we don't really realize how important it is for everything we do. Now, so what we're trying to do when we develop expertise is we're building a library, sort of a library of circuits or of patterns. And that library of chunks is what allows us to gain the expertise so that we can make connections in between and come up with creative ideas. Now, here's the thing. We often think that some of our best traits are really bad. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's take poor memory. You often think poor memory is a really bad trait, right? Well, it's actually a super good trait. And here's why. Remember how I was telling you about those 4 slots of working memory? Well, some people, they've got those slots of working memory and they can just remember anything and they can kind of do mental somersaults with it. They can remember this, and this, and they can put it all together and, move ahead really quickly. Some people are more like me. It's like, I knew this, now, wait, what was that again? It looked shiny, and you're distracted easily. Turns out that people like that are more creative. So, do you have to work harder and longer to keep up with the ones who are like steel trap minds? Yes, you do. But the trade-off is that you can be really creative with what you're learning. You can't help it, because when something falls out of your working memory, something else comes in. Kind of random, but it does, and you come up with creative ideas more easily. So there's another aspect of thinking. We feel bad because we think we're really slow thinkers sometimes. I mean, have you ever been in a class and there's like this person who's, the professor asks a question and they've got their hands up with the answer before the question's even done, right? They're so fast. It's kind of like these individuals have race car brains, right? And you might think of yourself as you've got a hiker brain, right? You can get there, but you're a lot slower. But think about it this way. The race car brain gets there really fast, but they have a very different experience. The hiker brain, you can reach out and touch those pine needles. You can smell the pine in the air, see the little rabbit trails. Your experience is it's very different, and in many ways, it can be far deeper. So if you have a slow hiker brain, actually it's something that you can be proud of, in that sometimes you can see things these race car brains miss. My hero in science is Santiago Ramon y Cajal. He's like, he won the Nobel Prize. He's the father of modern neuroscience. And what Ramon y Cajal said was, I'm no genius. I've worked with geniuses, but I'm no genius. And he wasn't. He said, I'm persistent and I'm flexible in the face of changing data. So if you have people with race car brains often leap to conclusions and then they can't change their mind when they're wrong. So if you don't have that race car brain, you've got the slow kind of thinking, you can really succeed, excel, and be a great contributor to society. Now, if you take a look at Miriam Mirzakhani, she won the Fields Medal, which is like the Nobel Prize for mathematicians. She was told as a child that she thought too slowly to become a mathematician. But now she's widely acknowledged as one of the greatest mathematicians alive. Now, as we're closing up here, I just want to cover two little things. We often fool ourselves. We have these illusions that we're competent in what we're learning, and we're not. So I'm going to give you two ways of overcoming your illusions of competence in learning. And one of the most powerful techniques is testing. Test yourself on everything you possibly can. So tests are the best. And what testing, and if you're a teacher, test your students. 1 hour of testing as opposed to 1 hour of just sitting and studying, your students will learn far more during that hour of testing. And testing is not just for, like, we often think that only, like, flashcards should only be used for, language study or maybe parts of the anatomy or something like that. And actually, they can be very helpful for learning in math and science. In the West, at least, we're often discouraged from memorizing equations. But on the other hand, poets will tell you, if you want to understand the poem more deeply, memorize it. Why should we let the poets have all the fun? Right? If you memorize an equation, you'll look at it more deeply. If you train yourself to do that, why did that multiply? Why did this divide? And if you memorize some of these key equations, it can help you to do better in your studies. So the other thing, we already talked about hard start and jump to easy. If you take one thing from this lecture, I would like it to be the idea of recall. So recall it's like this. When you're looking at something that's really hard to learn, you look at it, what's the best way to learn it? It's to look at the page, look away, and try to see if you can remember what the key point was. That's all. It's such a simple technique. So it was actually compared with concept mapping, rereading, underlining, and then recall. It turns out is far more effective. But what it does is it helps build your understanding. You're not just remembering the key point. Somehow it's helping hook in that understanding even better. So in closing, what I'd like to say is this. We're often told, follow your passion. But passions develop about what we're really good at. Some things, as it turns out, take much longer to get good at. So I always say, don't just follow your passions. Broaden your passions, and your lives will be greatly enriched. Thank you so much.